it's a real pleasure. I was excited that John and the other organizers of tonight's event invited me. As it was earlier stated, I have a real vested interest, having served on the state finance, transportation finance committee for the last 4 years. And I'm going to try to make this, my little comment, not political at all, but just a kind of a wake-up call in terms of where we're at, with an understanding that we really want to get to the bottom of the whole idea of whether or not this is something that, as Minnesotans, particularly in the counties that were mentioned, is this something that we really want? Is it something that we can afford? In the last session, believe me, not a political commentary, but just a reality, we increased the general fund by the largest in our state's history. We now have the second highest income tax rate in the United States. And if those things would not have happened, we got testimony, we heard testimony from the Minnesota Department of Transportation about a tens of $billion need over the next 20 years to update, to improve, to add to our transportation infrastructure, whether it be existing roads that need to be repaired because they're past their useful lives, or bridges. We had another bridge that will need to be taken down and replaced. And all those different things add up to between $10 and $20 billion in additional spending over the next 20 years. Now, that's not factored into the general fund increase, because most, if not all, of that comes from dedicated funds. And the dedicated funds, of course, are attached to what you pay in a state tax on your fuel. Of course, we know that we're using less fuel because of mandates by the EPA to drive more fuel-efficient vehicles. So we're going to have to come up with a new formula for that, which indeed will result in an additional tax on top of that. But what I can tell you, to just get started, that what was presented, if we wouldn't have had those other large tax increases that locked and loaded in legislation, was at least 10% per gallon tax rate on the price of gasoline. I only raise that question to understand, to help us to understand that sometimes we can want a lot, but rarely can we afford all of the government we want, but we can't afford the government we need. And it is the government's responsibility to make sure that we have good roads and good bridges, good transportation, whether it be freight rail or passenger rail. But we need to be mindful of, it's the people in this room that will be paying the freight, pardon the pun, on what this will cost in order to both build $2 to $4 billion over the next number of years. And honestly, if we're being really truthful about it, the operating costs. And I'm hoping that our economists will talk to us, speak to that a little bit tonight. If not, I'll ask the questions. But rarely do we have public transportation where there, in fact, I don't know of a case in the United States where there is not a significant amount of operating costs that come from the tax dollar. So besides building it and whatever impact it might have between Rochester and the Twin Cities, Greenfield project, Long 52, however you looked at the maps back there, please understand that yes, it is the government's job to build roads and bridges. It is an economic necessity. How do we get the commodities that we produce in this state to market if we don't have good roads and good railroads? We don't. So I'm an advocate, and that's why I served two terms or 4 years on the state government's, the State Transportation Finance Committee. But we also have to be smart. We have to be smart. We only have so much money to invest, and as citizens, we have to be encouraged. In fact, from here, my hope is that the information that is gleaned from this presentation doesn't stop here. We need to count on you to take away from this presentation and the questions that are asked, and you need to be talking with your neighbors, because it will make a significant difference to the future of our state.
Anybody have any questions? No questions at all? Okay.
What's the advantage of all these people promoting this high-speed rail when it hasn't worked other places? I mean, it seems like the track records would precipitate any plus or positive to doing this kind of stuff. So I'm trying to understand why there's a fervor to do this.
The advantage is that it's very, very expensive. And because it's very, very expensive, some people are going to make a lot of profits. To build a road, you send out a bulldozer, grade the road grade, put some gravel on top, put some pavement on top of that. It's simple. It's a commodity. It's cheap. Nobody's making huge profits from it. Build a rail line, and every single foot has to be custom engineered. So there's all kinds of engineering and design firms that get their fingers in this. Parsons Brinckerhoff, HDR, HNTB, Parsons, a whole bunch of other companies get involved in this. They get the contracts to do the initial studies. Then they make $10 million from the initial studies. They take $1 million of that and hire lobbyists to go out and promote the construction. Because if it gets built, they're going to get contracts for hundreds of millions of dollars. So it just cycles on. Once you build the first line, then you're making somebody really, really rich, and they'll take even more of their money to lobby for even more. We see this over and over again with light rail in Minneapolis, with light rail in Portland, and other urban transit systems. It's just a way of, just a form of corporate welfare. And you know, there are a few environmentalists who are out there being the moral voice of the corporate crony capitalists, but really there is no environmental argument in favor of high-speed rail. It comes down to somebody's going to make a lot of money, and they're willing to take a little bit of that money to lobby for it in advance. Yes?
How many seminars have you given around the country? To me, this makes sense. When you just said to us, it makes sense. How many high-speed rails have you been able to shut down because of this? Because of your seminar, it makes sense to stop down.
Well, I work on all kinds of transportation issues, including light rail, streetcars, and things like that. This is my 17th presentation in September. I've been credited with helping convince the governor of Florida to turn back the funds for high-speed rail there. I've been credited with convincing the governor of Wisconsin to turn back the high-speed rail funds there. Nobody's giving me credit for convincing the governor of Ohio to turn back the high-speed rail funds, but I suspect that he's aware of my work too. I did do presentations in both Wisconsin and Florida. I've done a whole bunch of presentations in California, and if it were put on the ballot again, it would definitely lose, but they're going to go out and spend $9 billion for their $117 billion system, even though they have no idea where the other $108 billion is going to come from, just because they can.
I was just wondering, what's the impact on rural emergency services when high-speed rail gets put into that kind of environment?
Well, we really don't know since we don't have any high-speed rail, but a large reason why it costs so much is because they have to have a lot of overpasses for roads. They're not going to have them for every single road. A lot of roads are going to be turned into dead ends, and that's going to create problems both for emergency services and for basic, farm-to-market type things. There's going to be all kinds of limits. Some farms are going to get split down the middle. Other farms are going to get divided from their markets, and so forth. So there are going to be impacts, and they don't care. Yes?
Two questions. One is related to the number of cars on roads. I read an article there a couple months ago that since 1985, cars on the road have doubled. Is that a fair statement?
The number of cars may have doubled. The amount of driving we've done hasn't quite doubled. It's gone up since 1970. It might have doubled since 85. Since 1970, it's gone up 150%. So it's more than doubled since then.
Okay. My second question is, they tell us that us older folks that are around right now are probably living pretty good, and the next generation isn't going to live as good as we have. We spent the last 50 years in the world trying to make the world look like us, and it's not getting done. The last 10 years have been a disaster trying to make the world look like us, and so I'm not sure we're going to need all this stuff you're talking about. I do appreciate your presentation, though.
Well, unfortunately, in the last 6 years, we've been spending too much effort trying to make us look like Europe. or at least make us look like what the rail fans think Europe is really like. The truth is, Americans drive for 85% of their travel and take trains for 1%. Europeans drive for 79% of their travel and take trains for 6%, both intercity and urban trains. The difference isn't that great. It comes at a huge, crippling cost to the European economy. Greece, for example, the big problem with Greece, the reason why their economy tanked and they had to be rescued by Germany is because the cost of running their rail system. The Spanish economy is teetering on the brink because they decided to try to build the biggest high-speed rail network in the world. They actually have more miles of high-speed rail than France, even after you delete the line they built that only had 9 passengers a day. And yet, for all of that, still, 79% of their travel is by car. It's not working to get people out of their cars. It's not saving people time or money. It's merely putting a huge burden on their economy. We don't want that. I don't think we want that. I want to go back to 1964 when user fees paid for everything. We might have to get creative about how to do that. But if user fees are paying for everything, then we know whoever's providing the transportation is going to care about the users and not about how they can please the appropriators who are giving them the money. Okay.
I think it'd be really interesting to think about all the Google cars parked outside of Mayo Clinic every day. I mean, we could just have a zillion of these little self-drive cars, for all these people that are needing transportation. But I'm curious to know who invited you, and I'm wondering who's paying your salary to come.
Well, that's a good question. It was reported in the newspaper that I was hired to come here, and actually the truth is I volunteered to come here. The Cato Institute pays my salary. It's been reported that the Koch brothers give money to the Cato Institute. That's only half true. Charles Koch got mad at the Cato Institute a couple of decades ago and hasn't given Cato any money, as I understand it. David Koch still gives some money, but I've never met either one of them. I have no idea what they think about high-speed trains or anything. I do know that they have a small government point of view and they give money to Cato for that reason. So my salary comes from the Cato Institute. I was brought out here to speak to the Sensible Land Use Coalition on Wednesday, and when I told people I was going to be here, they said, well, can you hang around until Monday and talk in Rochester? So I agreed to do that. And again, nobody's paying me anything that I know of to do this other than what I get from Cato. Yes? I guess we have to get a microphone. Somebody got a microphone? Okay, he's got a microphone. He'll be next, I guess.
Well, what's it going to take to kill this?
What's it going to take to kill this? Making sure that we never have a Congress dominated by Democrats again. In Oregon, there's no incentive to be a Republican or a Democrat, so I'm an independent. I vote for the candidate, not the party. But the truth is that the Democrats are the ones who want to pass out money for high-speed rail, even though there's no money to pass out. They want to borrow money from China to do it. The Republicans don't, most of them. So as long as at least one house of Congress is controlled by the Republicans, it's very unlikely that any more money will ever be appropriated by Congress for high-speed rail. If we ever get a Congress in which both houses are dominated by Democrats, then the floodgates might open and they'll start building lines to Duluth. But Rochester is lower on the priority list than Duluth for some reason. And you might be able to win just based on that.
Is there any success stories at all about high-speed rail that Obama can say, look at this country or state or anything where it's really proved to work at all?
Well, it depends on how you define success. Certainly the first high-speed rail line in Japan was successful, both in that it carried a lot of people and that it actually made a profit, even covering all of its capital costs. I don't think any high-speed rail line since then has done that. Supposedly the line from Paris to Lyon covers its operating costs, but they won't release the figures for individual lines, so you can't prove that. They just claim that that's true. The Obama's definition, or the rail advocates' definition of success is different, though. Their definition of success is, do a lot of people ride it? Well, if you subsidize anything enough, a lot of people will use it, but that doesn't mean it's a success, so I quarrel with that definition. The subsidies to high-speed rail would just have to be enormous, especially in a market like Minneapolis to Rochester. Maybe not so much in a market like San Francisco to Los Angeles, but even there it would have to be enormous.
I have a question that obviously you're taking a lot of your good time to enlighten us what's going on. You're going to have some adversaries, and you highlighted a few of them. My question is right now is that Rochester is in the midst of trying to have a program called Destination Medical Center. We're trying to make this a destination play, yet we want to build a high-speed rail to get everybody out of here. I don't understand that concept, so could you comment on that?
Well, supposedly, I mean, I don't know what their reasoning is, but I've heard that their reasoning is Rochester isn't that exciting a place, so if they want to get top quality medical personnel here, they want to be able to get them into Minneapolis real fast so that they can enjoy the nightlife in Minneapolis and come back here and work days. I don't know if that's true, but they're planning to build a high-speed rail line to the airport. So you're going to get to the airport in 45 minutes instead of 90 minutes. And then if you want to go to downtown Minneapolis, you just take the Hiawatha Light Rail, which takes an hour. So you turn your 45-minute journey into an hour and 15 minutes when you could have done the same thing, an hour and 45 minutes, when you could have done the same thing just by driving to downtown Minneapolis. So you haven't saved any time at all. Maybe they have some other reason to do it, but let me tell you this. You look around the country, and you look at metropolitan areas, and you look at how much they spent on subsidized transportation infrastructure, and you compare that to their growth. And it turns out the ones that are spending the most on subsidized infrastructure are the ones that are growing the slowest. And the ones that are growing the fastest are the ones that aren't spending a lot of money on subsidized transportation infrastructure. What's the fastest growing urban area in the Midwest? It's not the Twin Cities, it's Indianapolis, which has such a skeletal transit system that a lot of people say it's not good enough even for a bus system. But they aren't spending much on their transportation infrastructure, and as a result their tax burden is low, and they're growing twice as fast as the Twin Cities metropolitan area. So I consider that to be a success, not somebody who spends a lot of money and slows down the growth of their region because they've increased the tax burden.
Thank you. I have one comment and a question. The county, when they do their presentation, is talking actually about the people that live outside of Rochester that are going to be commuting from the cities is one of their examples of why the high-speed rail is needed, and that they anticipate that Mayo will do a lot of subsidy for that. So your point about subsidy is quite true, but that's my understanding of why. My question is, we're also being told that there is high probability of private funding for this. Could you comment on where that has happened before and if it's likely to happen here?
It's not likely to happen here. It was promised for California. The original California high-speed rail plan was supposed to cost $10 billion. At that time, the University of California at Berkeley, some transportation people looked at it and said, at $10 billion, travel between Los Angeles and San Francisco on high-speed trains will be the high-cost form of travel. Driving, bus, plane will all be cheaper than high-speed rail at $10 billion. By the time they put it on the ballot in 2008, the cost had increased to $44 billion. So you think that it might have been cheaper than driving or flying? I don't think so. After voters approved it, suddenly the cost increased to $117 billion. Now, when it was $44 billion, they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to carry so many passengers that we're going to earn a profit operating it. So we'll just give it to a private operator, and they'll make so much of a profit that they'll be willing to contribute about $10 billion of the cost of construction. And they put it out, and guess what? They couldn't find a single private operator willing to put up even $1 billion, just a mere $1 billion, towards the cost of construction, much less $10 billion. So they ended up having to get all their money from the taxpayers. Now they're talking about using carbon credits or carbon trading profits, spending that money on the high-speed rail. It's very unlikely that they're going to earn enough money on carbon trading to be able to build much of a high-speed rail system. But private money, There's no private money in Japan. All the high-speed rail lines are built by the government, then they're given or leased at a very low price to private operators who then operate them, but they aren't paying for any of the cost of construction.
I have one here.
One more question. Your presentation, the media is out there. Has anyone been able to shoot holes in anything that you presented here to you and actually come out the next day and say, what you presented here tonight is not true? In other words, all your data and stuff. Has any of the media come out and shot holes through anything that you said tonight that said what you're saying is not true? Because it makes sense to me, what you said, so I'm kind of curious.
I'll tell you what they say in other cities. They say that Randal O'Toole is anti-trains. He's got a known track record for being anti-trains, and besides, he's funded by the Koch brothers, so you can't trust anything he says. They never address any of my factual issues. They only try to rely on innuendo and ad hominem attacks. And maybe that works for them. I refuse to engage in those kind of tactics as much as I can, so I don't think that's right.
I'd like you to comment on the possible financing for that they do some places in the world where they let a freeway, for instance, out on bids, and the people that bid on it bid for the construction, the maintenance, and for a period of years, maybe it's for 30 years, and the low bid gets the job, and that's their baby until it's done, and they set the rate when they give their bid to what they feel they have to have. And I was wondering if some of our roads and bridges could come under this. If you've traveled down by Chicago, some of them probably haven't, but those of us that have been through Chicago, you go through on those freeways and you're clicked about every 10 to 15, 20 miles, and you're billed for it at the end of the month, and it comes off your checkbook, and you get clicked both ways. If you go over a bridge, you get clicked. What do you think about this concept?
Well, that's called a public-private partnership. And it works there's two different kinds of public-private partnerships. The first kind is what I call the franchise model. In the finance world, it's called the demand risk model. And the way it works is you tell somebody, okay, you could build a road or a bridge from here to here. You build it at your cost, and then you toll it. And if nobody pays the tolls, then you lose the money. If people pay the tolls, you get to toll it for 30 or 40 years, and at the end of that time, the road becomes owned by the public. So we estimate in 40 years, you ought to be able to make a profit from it. And if you're willing to take the risk, go ahead and do it. There's no tax subsidy. There's no risk to taxpayers. All the risk is taken by the private contractor. I think that's a good way of doing it. I don't see any reason why the public should have to take that risk. The other kind is where the government promises to pay the person building it or the company building the facility a certain amount every year, whether or not they collect enough tolls or fares to cover the cost. So this typically happens when state or local agencies have a debt limit. For example, the Denver Transit Agency received approval from voters to spend $5 billion, although it turned out to be $8 billion, building a rail transit system, but they gave them a debt limit of only $3.5 billion. When the cost rose to $8 billion, they said, okay, in order to avoid the debt limit, we'll let this private contractor borrow the money, and we'll promise to pay the contractor enough that they'll be able to repay the debt. So it won't be a debt on our books, but we still have to pay the contractor the money. The contractor has no reason to be efficient because they're going to get paid back no matter what happens because the taxpayers are on the hook for it. Taxpayers take all the risk that nobody's going to ride the system, nobody's going to drive on the road, whatever it is, and the contractor is guaranteed a profit. I don't like that system very well. And that's the kind of system that would be used for high-speed rail. That's the kind of system that's used for many light rail lines. It's actually been used for a few roads, not very many, but I don't think it should be used for roads either. I like the idea of tolls paying for roads. I come from Oregon. We have no toll roads in Oregon, so it's a bitter pill to swallow, but I have to actually admit it from the viewpoint of creating links between users and providers. Tolls are the best kind of link. They're better than gas taxes because when you pay a gas tax, nobody knows where you're driving or when you're driving. They just know that you are driving. So they don't know where to put the money. With tolls, the money goes into the road you're driving on, and the user fee works very well. And the tolls will give a signal to the provider whether or not they have to expand capacity in order to keep up with the traffic.
1962 at the World's Fair of Seattle. You recall that?
Yeah,
and
I was there.
I was there also, and that's when we first had space exploration, and they had the monorail. I remember, and they ran that for about 30 years, but it caught on fire. I think it ran about
It's still
3 to
running
4
today.
miles in Seattle. Whatever happened to that? The thought was to put these pillars down between the freeway. Seattle was busy building freeways, and run the monorail from north to south in Seattle. Too many earthquakes or what?
That monorail is still running. It's a little tourist destination, and that's all. It's very, very expensive. It's not very fast. They put a measure on the ballot to build a monorail in Seattle a few years ago, and they said, we promise there will be no cost overruns. And if there is, we'll come back to you and ask for your permission to spend more. Well, there's always cost overruns for rail. It's partly because the people who design the systems want to get the contracts to build them, so they come up with underestimates. It's called strategic misrepresentation. So there's always cost overruns. And when it turned out to be a cost overrun for the monorail in Seattle, they came back to the voters, and the voters said no. Now, I understand that there's going to be another monorail on the ballot this November. Who knows whether they vote for it. People in Seattle are almost as weird as people in Portland, so they might vote for it. But Portland has voted against light rail the last 4 times it's been on the ballot, so maybe people in Seattle will be a little more sensible too. The thing is, a system that goes from point A to point B can't compete against a system that can go from 1 million origins to 1 million destinations. We have 4 million miles of road infrastructure in this country. 4 million, and they want to build a 12,000-mile high-speed rail system that will serve a tiny number of people that would cost more than the entire interstate highway system. So it can't compete against the automobile, except for very long distances, and then it can't compete against the airplane.
The Interstate Transportation Fund is going down probably because we have just tens of millions of people driving electric cars and pay no gas tax. Is there a variation of the toll road concept for electric vehicles that could get into the funding stream for the highways that's been looked at in any state yet?
Well, it's not just the electric vehicles, it's the increasing fuel economy of gasoline-powered vehicles. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that even with the increase in driving over the next few years, revenues from gas taxes are going to decline because cars are going to become so fuel efficient that people just aren't going to be paying that much gas tax. Gas taxes are not a very effective way of paying for roads for 4 reasons. First, none of them go to, almost no gas taxes go to local governments. They mainly go to state governments. So the local governments end up having to use property taxes and sales taxes and income taxes to subsidize roads. Second, gas taxes don't account for the time of day. So they don't deal with congestion. They don't provide any solution at all for congestion. Third, gas taxes aren't adjusted for inflation. And fourth, they aren't adjusted for more fuel-efficient cars. There's one solution that will solve all four of these problems, and it's being tested in my home state of Oregon. Oregon was the first state to have a gas tax and dedicate it to roads in 1919. Now it's the first state to dedicate what are being called mileage-based user fees. This is where you pay by the mile, and if you're driving on a state road, what you pay goes to the state. If you're driving on a county road, what you pay goes to the county. If you drive on the street in front of my house, which is in a private neighborhood association which owns the streets, you would pay my neighborhood association to drive on that street. So every nickel you pay would go to whatever road you're driving on, and that would give the road providers a very good link between them and the users. There's concerns about privacy, but the system's being tested in Oregon, and actually Minnesota has tested some systems as well. Absolutely guarantee privacy. There's no way for anybody to invade your privacy because the systems do not keep track of when you drove or where you drove. They just keep track of if you drove on a state road or a county road or a city road or whatever, but not when you drove or which particular state road you drove on. So your privacy is guaranteed. We solve all the problems, and I think we can use this system to eliminate traffic congestion completely. Here's a curious thing about roads. I'm an economist, and economists deal with supply and demand. Roads are the only thing whose supply decreases when the demand increases. If a lot of people want to go flying because it's Thanksgiving, the number of seats on airliners does not shrink. If a lot of people want to go to Florida hotels in the winter, the number of rooms in those hotels does not shrink. But when you're driving on a highway at 60 miles an hour, that highway is capable of moving 2,000 vehicles an hour. If it starts getting congested and you slow down to 20 miles an hour, suddenly the throughput falls to 1,000 vehicles an hour. You've lost half the road capacity. And most of our congestion is not because people are trying to drive, more than 2,000 people an hour are trying to drive on a road, but because we've got a road that's already congested and more than 1,000 people an hour are trying to drive on the road. If we can charge a toll or a user fee that increases when demand increases, that'll get some people to travel at a little bit earlier or a little bit later in the day when it's not so congested, the demand isn't so high. And we effectively double the capacity of the road throughout the day. We never get to the point where only 1,000 vehicles can drive on that road. We keep it up at 1,800, 2,000 vehicles per hour. By doubling the capacity, we're actually giving people more mobility when we charge a congestion toll rather than less. And this is a concept that's hard to understand. You pay more for something and you get more for it. That's actually the way the economy should work. What the rail advocates want is for you to pay more for something and get less for it. I don't think that makes sense. So mileage-based user fees are, to me, the right way to go. It's going to be a hard sell for a lot of people who've been used to paying gas taxes, but I want to eliminate the gas tax and start paying mileage-based user fees. In Oregon, the plan is to phase it in. They're asking for volunteers. They've asked for 5,000 people who are willing to stop paying gas taxes and pay mileage-based fees instead. And I'm one of the volunteers. We'll see if I get picked pretty soon.
I just had one question here. I heard you say they want to change the lifestyles. They want more compact developments, higher densities, transit-oriented developments, and this would go in connection with the high-speed rails, light rails. Could you elaborate more on that?
Yes. Planners for 80 years have believed that Americans should live in higher densities. You can go back to 80 years and look at the planning literature and they say, oh, this urban sprawl is awful. Now, it's interesting, urban sprawl began when steam railroads began, and people who were wealthy enough to take steam trains to commute to work started living outside the urban areas. When wealthy people moved out to the suburbs, nobody complained. Then streetcars were developed, and middle-class people started moving out to the suburbs, and nobody complained. Then the automobile came along, and Henry Ford Ford made the automobile so cheap that working class people could afford to buy them. They could afford to buy a lot out on the edge of town and build a house. And then people started complaining about urban sprawl. It's really, to me, class warfare against the working class. So in order to stop urban sprawl, they want to pack people into these high-density complexes. And they say it will reduce the amount of driving people do, but in fact, there's no evidence of that. And in fact, the Federal Transportation Research Board hired an economist from the University of California to look at this question, and he found that the link between transportation and land use, in other words, the idea that if we pack people in at higher densities, it's going to change our transportation habits, is so weak that it's too small to be useful in trying to save energy or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it doesn't work as far as doing the things they want to do, and yet planners have been behind this for a long time. The really strange thing is that in 1961, there was a woman named Jane Jacobs who lived in Greenwich Village, and they wanted to tear down her village and build high-rise apartments. And she said, she wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And she said, urban planners don't understand how cities work. These high-rises, that's not how a city works. And then she said, but I, Jane Jacobs, do understand how cities work. And they work like Greenwich Village, which, guess what, was 4- and 5-story apartment buildings with ground floors of shops, mixed-use developments. And urban planners read this book in 1961, and they said, she's right. We didn't understand how cities work. We were trying to tear down cities and build high-rises. What we should have been doing is trying to tear down cities and suburbs and build 4- and 5-story mixed-use apartment buildings. So that's become their goal. They actually have a name for it. It's called the New Urbanism. There's a group called the Congress for the New Urbanism, and their goal is to rebuild all suburbs to high-density mixed-use developments and mandate that all new development be high-density mixed-use. And this is actually happening in Portland, where 65% of residents live in single-family homes, and they want to change that to 41%. They want to put 59% in multifamily housing. In San Francisco, where they have mandated that 80% of all new housing be built in high-density developments along rail lines. And the Met Council is putting together its housing plan, and a part of it's what its so-called Thrive 2045 plan, and that's going to do pretty much the same thing. So I think it's a stupid idea. Americans don't want to live that way, and yet the planners think it's a great idea, and that's one of the reasons why they support rail transit, because it gives them an excuse to go in and rezone neighborhoods for higher densities. It's so bad that in Portland, they've gone to neighborhoods of single-family homes around rail stations and zoned them for apartments, and the zoning is so strict that if your house burns down, you're not allowed to rebuild it, you have to build an apartment. Yeah.
A year ago, I took the train out to western Montana and back, and of course, you go through the oil fields of North Dakota. And the train where it's going, should be going 80 miles an hour, is going 20 miles an hour because of the high water table and problems they're having out there. But all the trains are doing that. So now I'd like your comments about we're all of a sudden hauling all this oil from North Dakota on trains, and we don't seem to be able to do anything with any pipelines. And you talked about freight, oil would be freight, is a good way to move, or trains are a good way to move freight. So I'd like your take on this oil, transporting this oil with using trains, and how that should play out in the long haul.
Well, trains are a good way of moving freight, but sad to say, they're more expensive than pipelines. They tend to cost about 3 times as much per barrel of oil to move by train than by pipeline. So if you can get a pipeline built, you don't need to use the train. Well, guess who's against building a pipeline? First of all, the environmentalists. Second of all, the railroads. So the railroads are happy to have the environmentalists stalemate any new pipeline construction. And so we end up having the freight shipped by rail. Now, I really don't sympathize all that much with Amtrak passengers who are taking the train and getting to stay on the train an extra 8 hours or so because it's late because of the oil traffic. I love trains, and I was very much enjoyed riding Amtrak and being as much as 23 hours late because it gave me an extra day to be on the train. If you really love trains so much, why should you complain when you're getting to be on the train for longer at no extra cost? So, yes, that's been very disruptive to Amtrak traffic, and the truth is that the Empire Builder about 4 years ago was the most popular long-distance train in America, and now it's only number 3 because it's so unreliable. Yeah.
Would you comment on who the suppliers are for the equipment for the high-speed rails and what their domicile is, the company's domicile? And then the second question is unrelated, but has to do with who would be responsible for eminent domain regulations and using your first model for construction of roads and trains and so on?
Well, most of the suppliers for high-speed trains are either Japanese or European, and they would compete. The federal government has some made in USA requirements, and so what would happen is that a German company or a Japanese company or something like that would build a factory here and do the assembly here, but most of the parts would be made in Germany or Japan and then imported here, and the final assembly would take place here. And that's happened for streetcars and for light rail vehicles and things like that in order to comply with the Made in America requirements. As for, second question again?
The eminent domain.
Eminent domain, okay. Well, Minnesota Department of Transportation would probably be the lead agency in building a high-speed train from Rochester to Minneapolis. You wouldn't think so, but they were the lead agency in building the Hiawatha Light Rail line, even though the Met Council ended up operating the line. But as the lead agency, they have eminent domain authority, and I'm sure they would use it if there were any recalcitrant landowners who didn't want a high-speed rail going near their home or across their property.
Well, I was thinking about it in terms of your highway construction model for toll roads. If you're going to build toll roads and go with that where you had a private contractor doing the work and coming up with the bids, how would you work?
Well, if you were a private contractor and you didn't have eminent domain, what you would do is you would draw out 3 different routes to go from point A to point B. You can say to the landowners, okay, we want to build on one of these routes, and we'll build on whichever route we get the rights to build across your land from the landowners first. We'll pay, we'll pay whatever it takes, but we'll pay the cheapest amount, of the 3 routes. So if this route demands $10 million, and this route demands $50 million, and this route demands $25 million, we'll take the $10 million route. That happens a lot with pipelines. It's happened with toll roads in the past. You don't need to use eminent domain because somebody's going to say, hey, we're going to get some benefits here. We're getting money for it. We're going to get access to a faster road and so on and so forth.
You've had a real good speech tonight, but I don't see any Olmsted County Commissioners or any city council members here to listen to us. How are we going to get your presentation to them after tonight and see where their comments are going to come from?
Well, somebody's videotaping it, so you can get a copy of that. My presentation is available online. You can download that and show it to people. I include all of my comments in the notes section of the PowerPoint show, so you can show it to people. You can feel free to take my presentation apart and just use the slides you like. Everything I do is basically in the commons. There's nothing that I claim a copyright to except for the books, and that's the Cato Institute saying they have a copyright to it. So it's up to you to get it to them. I'm trying to provide you with the tools you need to be able to persuade other people. If you aren't persuaded that high-speed rail is a bad idea, I hope that I've helped persuade you that it's a bad idea. But if you were already persuaded when you came here, I'm hoping that I've given you some good ammunition that you can use when you talk to your friends and neighbors and elected officials about it.
One thing that you all should be aware of too, we did actually let them know personally about the meeting. The Olmsted County Commissioners and stuff, they were invited to come if they wanted to, so that was up to them.
They're busy, you know, but on the other hand, if they get 10 phone calls tomorrow or 10 letters in the next week, that's going to have a big impact on them. Who writes letters anymore? If you write an email to a politician, it's not going to have anywhere near as much impact as if you write a letter. So write a letter to your county commissioners, and if they get 10 letters, that's a landslide for them because they don't get very many anymore. Yes?
I think that the original concept of mass transportation is a good one when you look at the overall idea of global warming and environmental impact. But then when you're looking at the real statistics, then your eyes are open in a different direction. Governor Dayton is going to be coming on Wednesday, and there's also going to be a political debate the following Wednesday. My question is, have you talked to anybody at Mayo? Because everybody in this room, whether they say it or don't say it, are thinking the same thing, that Mayo really does have the bottom line word to the city council and to the county commissioners and the people who make a big impact. And I would like to know if I can vote as a taxpayer, whether I want my taxes raised for something that looks like a pie in the sky idea.
Well, I haven't talked to anybody at Mayo. I consider that your job. I think Mayo is not going to listen to me. I don't live here. I don't pay taxes here. I don't vote here. They're going to listen to people like you who do. And the county commissioner is going to listen to people like you who do more than they're going to listen to me. I have talked to county commissioners in the past and other elected officials, and I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to listen. I'm not going to try to force myself on them. I will tell you that mass transit made sense when not a lot of people owned automobiles. Today, almost everybody does. More than 90% of American households have an automobile. In the Twin Cities, 97.2% of workers live in a household with at least one automobile. More than 3/4 of workers live in a household with 2 or more automobiles. So only 2.8% live in households without automobiles. How do they get to work? Turns out of the 2.8% that live in households without automobiles, 26% drive alone to work. How do they drive alone to work if they don't have a car? Well, presumably they're borrowing a car, they're using their employer's car, an employer-supplied car, or they're using a shared car like a zip car or something like that. Another 11% commute to work by carpool. Only about 35% take transit to work. So more people who don't have cars get to work by car than take transit. What that really means is, even if you don't have a car today, transit is not relevant to you. For most people, it's not relevant at all. And the same would be true for intercity travel. If you've got a choice between paying $75 to go to Minneapolis by a high-speed train that will get you within an hour of downtown Minneapolis because you're going to have to take the Hiawatha line from the airport, or driving yourself, it just doesn't make sense to take a high-speed train.
This kind of goes to answering the question from the lady just prior. And I won't make this a gratuitous, vote one party or the other, but just to say, we're really only good as citizens of this country if we're informed voters. These are one of those. This is one of those issues that is a huge pocketbook issue for all Minnesotans. And I'd love to tell you which way that you should vote, but the fact is, or it does remain, that there's one party that is going to make this more difficult to happen. And it's not the party that's in charge now, but the best thing that you can do as an informed voter is to find out what's going on. Like the presentations here tonight. Making yourself informed before you go into the voter booth, and then before you select that candidate. It's important that you know where they stand on these issues. We've got a big election coming up on November the 4th. And if we put the same folks that we've had in the last couple of years, really nothing's going to change, and that needle's going to continue to move towards, we're going to build this thing whether it makes sense or not.
All right, well, thank you very much.
We've got one more here.
you were talking about cars and that type of thing, and I know I've heard in presentations here at the county commissioners or county planners and some mail-driven presentations that they talk about, they say these Gen Xers don't want to drive cars, or they always want to seek other forms of transportation. That's when they bring that mass transit thing up. And I always thought that, I believe I read an article someplace that Gen Xers, or whatever they are, actually do want to drive cars. It's just that they're a little bit more selective about their cars or something. But, they always seem to rationalize why people don't want cars and want mass transit, like trains, like rail type stuff. So, would you comment on that?
We had a financial crisis 6 years ago. We haven't really recovered yet. We still have very high unemployment rate, especially among young people. So of course they're not buying cars because they can't afford to do so. Most of them want to. The ones who don't want to are a very small minority. And the same is true with housing. We hear that they want to live in multifamily housing. So that's why we need to build all the multifamily housing for them. But actually when you poll them, 80% of them, just like every other generation, 80% aspire to eventually own a single-family home with a yard. So they aren't different from other people. They just have a different economic situation with high college loans combined with low employment rates. The economists who have looked at it, you can't prove exactly what's their motivation, but the economists have looked at it and found that the high unemployment rates alone are enough to explain any differences in car ownership among the millennial generation. I personally didn't have a car until I was 30 years old. That doesn't mean that when I was 29 years old, I thought everybody should be just like me. I'm weird. So I don't think everybody should be as weird as I am. On the other hand, I've discovered, and I consider this Randal O'Toole's law, everybody's weird. Thank you very much.